any more than getting on the phone with Denise and a 30-minute conversation turns into 2 hours later. And so I've heard such great things about this group. And so I'm really pleased and privileged to be here to talk with you today. So I think, one of the things that I loved about your introduction, I think you hit on some really key things about strategic thinking, these things that incorporate polarities, which is one of the things that I think makes strategic thinking so difficult. And we'll circle back to this a little bit later after we talk a little bit about what strategic thinking is. But in a really small nutshell, I will say strategic thinking cannot exist. It can't happen without diversity of thought. And this is something people think, a lot of times people say, oh, that must be so trendy. And actually, there's nothing trendy about it. It's just a fact that you cannot have strategic thinking without the real inclusion, without that real mix of mixed mindsets of diversity of thought. So I think the two are paired perfectly, and I would be so happy to respond to questions as we go along. I probably should start by explaining just a little bit about what strategic thinking is and what it isn't. It's whatever it is that you think it is. I promise you it's not that. It's certainly not strategic planning. Most of us, and I would guess probably everybody who's listening to this, probably has been very well versed and very well trained and is probably very experienced in strategic planning, which is great because we need that. And my hunch is probably every single person who's listening is also very well versed and exceptional at strategic implementation. What's often missing, and certainly what was the impetus to my research and to my practice, was the absence of strategic thinking. And strategic thinking is just one aspect of strategy. And I think at this level of senior executive leadership, people are used to working with strategy groups, okay? And strategy, however you want to, define it, it all boils down to really it's about setting the direction. And so strategic thinking is often the dimension that gets overlooked in strategic planning, and strategic implementation. And I like to use a triangle model, if you can imagine a triangle model with 3 different dots. One dot is strategic thinking, another strategic planning, and another is strategic implementation. And as strategists, as leaders, we really need to be adept and very, very fluent in all 3 of these. They use very different kinds of thinking, or that whole garbled mouthful of cognitions that underlie, the kinds of thinking apply. In other words, you can't use the same type of thinking for strategic as you use for strategic planning. The kind of thinking that you use for strategic thinking is a very nonlinear, highly intuitive, highly informal, very emotional kind of thinking. Whereas strategic planning requires a kind of thinking that is very linear, logical, rational, analytical. So these 2 kinds of thinking cannot function in our human brain at the same time, which is why it's so important for leaders to know on what I call the strategy triangle. As a leader, what is my true strategic intent for my team or for me or for my group or for my business or whoever you're working with? Is it really strategic thinking, which is very, very messy? Okay, and very nonlinear. And like I said, a lot of it happens outside of work. Or is it really strategic planning where you really want to get your ducks in order and come up with a plan and move forward with implementation? Or is it implementation where you want to get out there and just do it?
Hey, Susan, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So this idea of the strategic thinking, I think in many opportunities or many organization, HR and diversity, equity, inclusion ideas often come after the plan has been thought about,
Yes.
because it's very messy, as you said, if you're included in the kind of thinking part, and you've talked about it in your book and other places about divergent and convergent thinking. Can you talk a little bit about when you're in that meeting, how do you get people to really deal with the conflict that is probably going to come up and make it and get through the messiness of it?
Oh, you know what? I'm so happy you asked that question, because this is everything. People, I think, have to realize the difference between strategic thinking and strategic planning. Most of us, as you said, most of us actually encounter strategic thinking as an afterthought. Okay, I would ask you, the purpose of strategic thinking is to focus on the problem, not the solution. Do we have the real problem, and do we have the right problem? And to your point, how many of us, probably all of us, have been in meetings before where somebody has plopped a strategy on our desk or plopped a request for a strategy and said, hey, we need a strategic plan, or we need this thing implemented by, March 15th. And you take a look at it, or you take it to your team, and people look at it and they say, yeah, I'm sure, happy to do my part, but this isn't the real problem, or it isn't the right problem. This happens to us all the time. And it's an indicator that we really haven't engaged with strategic thinking. Because we often, and we're taught this and we're rewarded for this, where we identify a problem and boom, we match it with a solution before we backtrack and say, is this really the real problem and the right problem? So I think it's important that you give people a real heads up in terms of what is your focus. If it's strategic thinking, give a heads up to people and wave the red flag that you're going to have to roll your shirt sleeves up. This is going to be messy. And one of the things that makes it, strategic thinking, so messy and fearful is that we challenge the underlying assumptions of whatever that problem is that we've identified and been ordered a lot of times to implement. So it really means asking really good questions, challenging ourselves, inviting, which is so difficult to do. Inviting other people to challenge us, which most of the time people won't, because of power structures that are in place and because of our own past history of really asking questions that identify the underlying assumptions. So when people, I find, at least, when people know what strategic thinking is, they know it's going to be messy, and they know what's going to make it messy. They know that it's high risk. They're afraid. So I think you have to repeat this over and over and over. And what I have found is a little bit of knowledge and a whole lot of role modeling break the ice like nothing else.
Can you give us an example of that in action?
Yeah, that takes courage. I've had so many examples. A real recent example was I was working with a team of individual contributors who were very successful, had an impeccable track record. And they were now asked to become a strategy team. And A, they didn't know each other except by name. And B, they were extremely competitive, but they were very keen to set a strategy that was going to benefit each other. And so they said, oh, we've been at this, we're at executive level, we're in the C-suite, we don't really need any kind of information or instruction. And so they had invited me to come in and observe them. They were terrified. They were petrified. They were silent when it came to really assessing, what is the problem? And we had 6 people in the room, and I could see that they were not going to talk out of fear. So we took a break and I came back and I said, it seems to me we just need a little bit more time to kind of sit with this problem, because they wanted to race to solutions. And so I had them draw what they saw the problem to be. And it was so remarkable. It was so revealing. And that started the dialogue. So sometimes, and this is, again, I tend to use some fairly unconventional techniques. And that is one of them, that when you're dealing with something that is conceptual, which strategy is, when you're dealing with something that is conceptual and something that is complex, okay, a lot of times we can't formulate words for it. And if you can get people to draw, okay, it cuts through that like nothing else, because what it does is it shifts us from our rational mind into our irrational mind. And that opens up the possibility to dialogue. And we were aiming to dialogue critically. So that broke the ice. And then we were able to put some structure around it in terms of what I call surf and dive level questions, really getting into deep dive level questions.
Julia, we have a question here from Jennifer, and it's really timely. She says, how do you create a safe space for execs?
Jennifer, that's $1 million question. I think people need permission. And I think they need role modeling. So many of us in our roles of sitting in C-suite have really been, many times we've been hired in because people make the assumption that we think just like them. But strategic thinking requires a very conscious and a very explicit effort to maybe not hire in, but to hire into that meeting and to those meetings people whom you think will think very differently from you. That takes courage, and you have to be explicit about that. So I think when people know that they've been invited to a strategy meeting to make a contribution that's going to sound different from everybody else in the room, I think that can help to break the ice a little bit too, because one of the things I find it's funny, it's comical, but it's also annoying sometimes, is you listen, and I know everybody on this call has been in this situation. You listen in strategy meetings, and it truly is this massive echo chamber. That's not benefiting the organization at all when it comes to strategic thinking. It benefits the organization to have same frame thinkers when you're trying to plan and implement. But when you're trying to do strategic thinking, you are deliberately and very consciously looking for explicit points of view and questions that are different. So I think that you have to remind people of that over and over. I think that gives people the permission to kind of dip their big toe in. Then I think it's up to us as executives to reward challenge and to reward those questions as a way of pulling out more. And I think you have to a lot of times go back to the purpose of this meeting is strategic thinking. We're not going to touch solutions because that belongs in strategic planning. But we're here in this meeting for strategic thinking. And people go, oh, yeah. And you think, haven't I just repeated this like 25 times? So people need that reminder, because we can't assume it's safe to challenge, particularly challenge assumptions. And Jennifer, if I can add on to that, I always say, people always say, yeah, I know, I've been to 6 classes on assumptions. And that's great. It's wonderful. It's familiar vocabulary to them. That's great. But I will tell you, my hope and my intention is always to get them to really experience when somebody has hit on one of their own assumptions. That's a real different thing than to have knowledge about what an assumption is. My intention and my hope is also that they will be able to identify when other people have hit on other people's assumptions, because that's what strategic thinking is about. I always say it's like taking, a water balloon that we all played with as kids, to take a water balloon and say, this water balloon is my strategy. Okay, I've invested heavily in it. Okay, I've hired a bazillion people, $1 bazillion. Okay, I think it holds water. But the reason I've, assembled all of you is to invite you to poke holes in this thing. Okay, that metaphor tends to make it helpful, I find, too, for people like, oh, that's why we're here. That's a little odd. I've never been invited. And they will test the waters slowly.
So you have some the people curious about some information here, Julia. So Kim says, it seems similar, what you're talking about seems similar to LEAN, lean problem solving. And then she says 5 whys gap analysis, and then fishbone tools. So can you address that? And then let me tell you, got some other dialogue too.
Wonderful. Those are all helpful tools. They're all tools that I recommend. If you want to type those in the chat box, they're all wonderful strategic planning tools, and I recommend all of them. It's great. What tends to happen, those belong in the domain of strategic planning, because the purpose of strategic planning is to come up with solutions. But at any time in using any one of those instruments, you can certainly bounce back to strategic thinking. The purpose of strategic thinking is not to problem solve, but rather to focus on, do we have the real and the right problem? So you really do go deeper. And those, I love all the tools that you've mentioned. And like I said, I'd invite you to, type those in the chat box if you like. But I think it's important to really look and see how much comfort you have in using those tools. If people are very comfortable with using those tools and they're kind of keeping their thoughts on the surface, okay, it's time to really pull the tools away and really deep dive. I like to get people into groups, to mix it up often, as in just about every single meeting. I always say, mix up the faces, mix up the places, mix up the spaces, mix it up, mix it up, mix it up. What that does is it kind of keeps people on guard a little bit, where people are just a little bit confused constantly when they go into strategy meetings. They're thinking, why is that person here? How come she got invited? Who's that? Oh, I've never seen. Well, he looks awfully young to be here. It kind of keeps people on guard. That's very, very, very good for our thinking. We're thinking, why are they here? What are they here? Especially as they begin to ask questions about things that they have no stake in. Because there's nothing for them to lose when they hit on an assumption. So that's a couple of things. And it gets people familiar with the idea of mixing it up, mixing it up, mixing it up, mixing it up. Otherwise, what tends to happen is we get same frame thinking that sets in very, very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And Susan, you have your hand up. And then after that, I see a couple more questions in here. But Susan, I know you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was listening, and to me it immediately was, you're defining the problem with your strategic thinking. You're finding those elements that you haven't thought about as the typical process for moving forward. Does that mean sometimes when it's a C-suite group, they have to invite people from outside the C-suite, or it's a consultant that can give them information? I remember from architecture, we would bring in the outside resources we were going to work with to understand the best construction methods at this time based on dollars being spent, things you weren't thinking about before you even started to plan. And I think when talking about diversity, it's bringing in the people who are experiencing whatever this problem might be. If it's the people in the field or the members of a team that are maybe outside of that. And then, as you said, creating a safe space for them to share their experience in a way that allows others to hear something they've never even thought about.
Beautiful. Really, really nicely said. Well said. It's that value of the outside perspective. And I think depending on the context, as we spin the wheel, we all can take the stance of the outsider, depending on how the wheel spins and what the context is. So I think as leaders, getting in the habit of inviting whatever we see and whatever our team sees as the outside perspective. Sometimes that can come internally within an organization, just because if you look at strategies, particularly in the C-suite, where do they come from? A lot of times that perspective comes from the strategic planning suite, okay, from the strategic planning office, which means by definition, there's going to be a high level of same frame thinking. And that's fantastic for planning. But I think for strategic thinking, where what you want to do is say, how could we possibly test this water balloon? I like to invite graduate students in. They have absolutely no vested interest at all. I like to invite people and getting them to, select people and mix it, but to invite people at all levels, to invite part-time people who are, almost never included in strategy sessions, to invite, for any organization, I like to invite artists to come in, architects to come in, anybody who's got a visual background to come in and just draw what they hear. Okay, it's just enormously helpful. Even if people say, I don't get this, they have been introduced to another way of understanding what the problem is. It's very, very, very useful. To bring in people who are retired, okay, bring in customers at all levels, but mix it up, is the name of the game. Yeah.
So here's another question. You have a few questions. I'm sorry. Denise, when you say
Nope,
something?
I was going to say a couple questions are coming.
Okay.
They're coming fast and furious, Susan.
I know it. I know. So Kong, I think that's how you pronounce your name. I hope so. Correct me if I'm wrong. Kong says, I'm curious, how does strategic thinking relate to diversity of thought? So that's from Kong.
Yeah, you know what? Thank you for asking that, because in my way of looking and working with strategic thinking, they fit together like a hand and a glove. I think it's important for somebody or somebodies within the organization, excuse me, to keep track of what I call, the frames that we typically use, to note what are the common frames that we bring to strategy meeting. Most of the time, I'll tell you what research shows. For senior level executives, okay, that's at the C-suite level, there tends to be an enormous perception gap. At the C-suite level, execs tend to believe that they use around 19 to 21 different perspectives before they'll take a strategic decision. In reality, they don't. They use two, and I'm sure you can guess them. Technology and finance. How much is this thing going to cost us? What kind of new tech are we going to have to invest in? And they'll say, okay, my decision's made. How about you? So there's a big difference into how you would shape a decision in terms of setting direction based on two criteria, which is technology and finance, versus what their perception is, that it's 19 to 21. So we get locked into same frame thinking very, very, very quickly. And then we tend to select people and deselect people based on familiar frames and same frames. So diversity of thought means really paying attention to what are the familiar frames, what are our habitual frames that we use all the time, and who could we invite into these meetings? Who else? And who else? And who else can we invite in? Who might think differently? And our thinking, we know, our actions are informed by our thinking. And our thinking is informed by our experiences. Sniff around. Once the culture of the organization kind of gets the hang of, oh, actually, they really are interested in people who think differently. Maybe I'll raise my hand. Okay, maybe I'll raise my hand. That takes a while for rumors to spread that people truly are genuinely interested in different thinking. Because I think sometimes people think, so what's the real benefit? We all read the statistics, but what's the real benefit to my organization to have people who think differently than I think? Okay.
Mhm.
It's tremendous in
And
terms
to that point about differential, like you said, retired, Susan also said interns are great too, to include, because, you know, they can ask questions other people wouldn't have thought about. So, and then Ryan says, since strategic thinking can get messy, how do you suggest structuring strategic thinking sessions to keep everything on track?
Okay, the track needs to include big ditches, is what I always say. Okay, you need the track because the whole purpose of strategy ultimately is to reach successful implementation that has a really tightly structured plan that has been informed by a really messy strategic thinking process. So you need to have big ditches that people can go to. Once people kind of have that metaphor, it's like, okay, you know, we'll go there. We'll go there to play. And that's what you do. It's intentional play. You go there to say, you know, who might discover something, you know, that nobody else saw. Most of us are afraid to go there. And most of us are afraid to lead people there because we're afraid we'll get stuck in the ditch. But I always say, don't worry. We've got plenty of good strategic planners, strategic implementers who can yank you out of the. What we lack is people who really can think about complex issues using complex thinking. Okay. And that requires that we really get in the ditch and really get messy. So I wouldn't worry. You know, you have to tell people these things over and over and over, and then you have to let them get messy. I think there's no substitute for experience. And you also have to let them see other people get messy, or there won't be any trust.
And when you say get in the ditches, go ahead. I was going to say, when you say get into ditches, give me an example of what does that mean, getting in the ditch?
Getting in the ditches, get off track. Okay. Get off the track. See what else is out there. Okay. Staying right on the track is like being the engineer, and we need good engineers. And as a strategist, we need to know when we're on the track and when we're off the track. But if what we're really looking for within a company is an innovative strategy and also a sustainable strategic thinking process that is embedded, we need people who cannot be afraid to get off track, to explore, to discover. And that requires a very different type of thinking. It requires intuition. Okay, intuition is a type of cognition, and it's absolutely necessary to learn what's our level of intuitive thought and what's, excuse me, you know, what are my hunches? To pay attention to that. It's also highly emotional. And most of us, probably all of us, but most of us are taught strategic planning is devoid of emotion. It's true. Strategic thinking is full of emotion, and it's primarily by fear. And that fear is, what if I make a mistake? Okay, what if I say something that offends somebody else? Yeah. What if? And it holds us back and keeps us right on track instead of ditch.
Okay, Kim had a question. Oh, she raised her hand. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. I think I may be very similar to Ryan. I am a very linear I need a goal. I need something to define for people. And I've been in these sessions of strategic thinking where it is all over the map and there's Post-it notes up and everything. And you could have these forever. You could have meetings upon meetings upon meetings. And how do you help people frame, okay, we've been here for an hour in messy, going down ditches, thinking off the track, etc. Now what? Do we just hold another one next Monday? Like, how do you tell people where this is all going? Or we have 10 minutes left in this session. What did we get out of this session? What do we prioritize? What do we want to focus on? How do you do that for people?
I think for strategic planning, you really have to, you blow the whistle. You blow the whistle. I think as a leader, you don't want people getting stuck in that strategic thinking dot, because that's just as dangerous as getting stuck in the strategic planning dot or the strategic implementation dot. And I think as a leader, this is one of our responsibilities, is that somebody has to keep track of, are we on the track? Are we in the ditch? Are we fixing the, tracks? So somebody has to keep track of that. And that would be us as the leader.
Yeah. I think the other is that you have to create whatever the exercise is to get divergent thinking. You've got to have an end. One of the ones I like is kill the company. It's called Kill the Company. And so it literally brings in all kinds of people, like you're saying, and making sure that the room is set up properly from voices and spaces. But the goal is kill the company. And so you can put it in a time place of when have we killed the company. And that gives you all the competitors. It tells you what things might be coming out of sideways, et cetera, because you allow people to kind of, wish and say, well, AI could, or the Chinese weather balloon could, blah, 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 or Russia could, blah, 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 blah. And it allows for that open thinking, but you also have a way to bring it back and to come down and say, okay, which one should we really be paying attention to? So I think it is very important, from what I hear in the conversations we've had, is that you have to, as the facilitator of the room, you have to design the meeting in such a way that you have the right people in with different perspectives, give people permission, but you've got to have a conversation process that takes people out and then brings them back in. And we have a question from, do we have any that's been waiting, Michelle?
Yeah, Kong and then Susan.
Okay.
So Julia, my question has to do with when we're engaging in the strategic thinking planning session, earlier you point out about the mess that we can often get ourselves in, perhaps due to a variety of reasons, but mainly different opinions or perspectives. My question is, how do we help others get focus and discipline on a certain topic without allowing their personal mess to get in the way, right? Because when you think about it, leadership is leading from the inside out, as you've heard. And one of the things that I've been focusing on recently is coaching executives about this topic of DEI, as well as guiding them through the conversation without allowing their personal mess to get in the way. And we all have personal baggages that we bring up with us to work. And so how do you differentiate, the personal and professional mess so that we can get people on track to our goal?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I think that this compartmentalization can sometimes be taken to the extreme. Our experiences, our personal experiences, have an impact on who we are as professionals. They really do influence us. And how we've been burned. Okay, when we've been burned, who's burned us, how we've processed or not processed, our personal stuff gets in the way and is sometimes highly advantageous to who we are as professionals. So I think it's important that people realize that compartmentalization is a little bit arbitrary. Okay, and having said that, I think it's also important to say, help people keep focused on what is the purpose of strategic thinking. The purpose is not to solve problems. The purpose is to test our problem. So testing our problem, I say, invite people's experiences, and I mean, they may not need to name them. I think different people have very different comfort levels in terms of what we share, professionally and publicly, and what we tend to hold on reserve. But it's still going, whether I share things or not, my background and my experiences are still going to inform my professional insight. So I think getting people to make a conscious choice about what they're explicit about and what they're not explicit about is important. And I think keeping people focused on the purpose is testing the problem. A lot of times we get so focused on, we're like hungry dogs. Somebody puts a problem out there and it's like, go run in terms of a solution. And I think it's really hard sometimes to break that habit, because it is a habit of, you throw a bone out and the dogs are going to run when you say go. And we do the same thing. And strategic thinking is not about solving the problem before we know what is the problem, and is it the real problem, and is it the right problem. So our experiences do inform our professional outlook, our professional behaviors. They guide us and they set frames, and they're hard things to acknowledge. Okay, and I think also giving people other venues. Sometimes people get caught up with oversharing, and oversharing is a personal thing. People are going to define that individually very differently. So just getting people to be comfortable with themselves in terms of how much of their personal life do they want to share versus how much of their personal life do they just simply want to acknowledge is informing their perspective and their decision making.
See, Julia, you got some good interest here because Susan has her hand up now.
The thing that comes up for me repeatedly about strategic thinking is sometimes it's focused on something you're trying to make a short-term change in. Other times it's something that is a longer-term impact for a company that you still have to keep the company running day to day. It doesn't mean you're going to fix the big issue in one session. However, you are looking at what can you make strategically thinking choices about how to move those into planning and process to get to a point at a later date and time. And how do you then decide what pieces become imperative to address immediately and what ones become, this will require more, let's do some more, discussion, feedback, whatever. And I think sometimes everything comes down to, if we meet on it, we have to know exactly where we're going now. And to me, sometimes it's not a now decision.
No. This makes me think of one of the elements of strategic thinking is altitude, constantly checking your altitude. This goes back to this. You probably picked up on this, but there's a highly visual component to strategic thinking. But checking your altitude, what is the altitude? And this is something, a vocabulary word that I think needs to be, shared by everybody who is invited to all of these strategic thinking sessions, but to check your own altitude. What's the altitude at which you're seeing the problem? Because, if you're taking a very, very, very high altitude, you're going to want to make sure that you are, have the fluidity and the fluency to come down and check your altitudes, until you get to the ground, like I always say, a bird on the forest floor, and then move that bird up to a log and move the bird up to a branch and to a higher branch and then above the clouds. But this is fluency. This is fluency, strategic fluency. And this is something that we need. And it's something that we need to call each other out on and just check. And one of the best ways to do this is to really draw your problem, because then we have something that we can go back to, and then we have something that we can compare, that we can have a critical dialogue with, where people will check their altitude against some of the people sitting at the next table to say, oh my gosh, isn't this weird? We're looking at the same problem, but from very different altitudes. You can uncover and engage people in some very, very deep, critical dialogue by simply doing that, because it's safe. It's safe. Everybody's drawing looks ridiculous and people think it's funny. And then that pulls them right into a conversation where they see what different altitude they have. And that leads to conversations about, what could have caused that? To your point, is that something that we really need to enact right now? Or is that something we can work on enacting, in 6 months or in 6 years or something? So things like this that are, slightly different, I think can go a long way to guiding us into a real critical dialogue.
We have one more
Jennifer,
question
yeah.
from
Jennifer.
Jennifer. Excuse me, is it Jennifer Irwin? I believe it is. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I think it's a really great conversation about the altitude of where you're at when it's really about setting the stage for what you're trying to accomplish with your strategic thinking session. And you may have one that talks about longer term problems that are going to cause longer term effects and problems that are causing short-term effects, and really framing the discussion around those things first. And I think the more, it doesn't mean that those things can't come up in the opposite sessions, but there's a parking lot for a reason, right? And so I think it's about appreciating all the diverse thought and all the diverse ideas, and then making sure they're addressed in the right forum at the right time. Because when you get into the strategic planning phase, and you're trying to figure out how to solve certain problems, I forget whose point it was, but really there are some things that didn't happen overnight. They're not going to be fixed overnight either.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to include the strategic planning of longer term problem solving, sometimes into some of our shorter term solutioning, to help continue to move us in the right direction. And I think it's just really making sure people are comfortable with that being called out and the facilitator leading those discussions.
Those are excellent points. Excellent points. And I think this vocabulary, a lot of times we don't have within organizations, we don't have a shared vocabulary and we don't have shared concepts around strategy. So you have people who come into a strategy meeting and they're thinking, of course, this meeting is all about implementation. They bring their tray out and say, here, fill it. Just tell me what to do and I'll go do it. Mm-hmm. You get other people in that same meeting who think that they're there to plan. And their time horizon, is like within the next 6 months. Other people who are just like, wait a minute, I looked at the problem. That's not even the real problem. We need to take this thing, rip it apart, blow it apart, really start from scratch. And we have all of those people who have their silent thoughts in this meeting and nobody's happy. So I think it's important, to both of your points, to really embed some common vocabulary and common concepts around strategy. And strategic thinking needs to be differentiated from strategic planning, from strategic implementation. This notion of altitude, checking your altitude, if we don't do and call an altitude check, and people are like, oh, altitude, I had no idea. I was looking like a bird on the forest floor running around, and somebody else was looking like above the clouds. That's going to cause real problems, a collision course, when you get to strategic planning. Another thing is when we are able to check and change our altitude, longevity it's a natural thing that pops up. How long into the future are we looking? Okay, that comes from altitude. So we're looking at altitude and longevity. Another thing, if I can, you just made me think of this, and I kind of thought it might be helpful. Let me read off a list of 5 attributes that are necessary for strategic thinkers. I think you've guessed all of them. One is imagination. This whole idea, we're focused on the problem, not the solution. Do we have the real problem? Do we have the right problem? So we need a good imagination. Second is a broad perspective. And this is different perspectives, different perspectives. And altitude. Those different perspectives are going to see things at different heights very differently. Third thing is an ability to juggle. This is not multitasking. This is This is more like, I like to think of it as more like a mobile, that thing you hang above babies' beds, where you pull one string and they all kind of jump. That's what strategic thinking is about. And you have to keep your eye on that. And everybody has to keep their eye on that, and they're going to see it differently. Fourth thing is an ability to deal with things over which we have no control. This is taking a look at economics, things like finance, things like natural disasters, like social issues, things like technology issues, things like political issues, military issues, because those things have an influence on every single one of our businesses. And it's going to look very differently as we change the altitude, the scope, okay, of what we're able to see about all of those elements is really going to be so different. So we need to be able to deal with things over which we have no control, and to distinguish what can we control and what can't we control. Because in strategy, the things we cannot control, when those things that we cannot control are occurring, it feels like we've got the strategic rug pulled right out from under us. The things we can control usually get weeded out and filtered out in strategic planning. But those things, like, for example, right now we have the war in Ukraine. We have about more than 30 conflict areas in the world. We have drought. We have famine. We have climate issues. We have economic issues. All those come together. We can't control those as individuals, but we have to factor them in. So that's going to depend on our altitude. And then the last thing is we have to have a desire to win, which is this real competitive spirit. So I thought I'd share those 5 because I think you've guessed them.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour.